Hello, welcome to week 7 of practicing Stoicism. This week we only have a single remark we're looking at. It's longer. It's remark number 29 in the handbook. And it's one in which Epictetus draws an extended analogy between, on the one hand, physical training, the kind of training that you might undergo if you were going to become an Olympic athlete, and the training that's involved in becoming a philosopher. And the first thing he says is, before you set about anything really that's substantial, he recommends that you think about it. Remind yourself what the nature of that thing is, right? What sorts of things come before the activity? What sorts of things come after? What's the nature of the activity itself? These are all sort of things that you can question yourself about, remind yourself about. And partly he recommends this because he says frequently what happens is people start out on things without having thought about it, without having considered the nature of the whole project. And then when things get hard, they end up quitting. So he suggests you do that first. For example, he says, in the case of Olympic training, or if you want to be an Olympic athlete, there's a whole lot involved, right? The first is, of course, the training itself is extensive, right? You have to keep a strict diet. You have to follow a specific exercise regime. Basically, you have to, he says, surrender yourself to your trainer. You have to kind of put your life in the hands of your trainer, almost in the way he says you would with a doctor, right? So in addition to comparing the philosopher to the athlete, he also compares the philosopher to a patient, right? Somebody who is ill. We've seen that in some of the other passages. Somebody who needs help in curing themselves, okay? Once you undergo all that training, then there's the actual contest itself, he says, which is going to be hard, right? You have to dig in, perhaps get hurt, dislocate a hand, or twist an ankle. And after all that training, all of the difficulties, you still might lose. Okay, so those are the kinds of things you have to take into account, he says, when deciding whether or not you're going to try to become an Olympic athlete. And he says, after you've thought about all those things, if you still want to do it, go ahead, right? Currently, he says, though, what happens is people typically don't think about it first, right? And in that way, he says, they behave more like children, right? What do children like to do? They like to play at different things. They like to pretend they're wrestlers, or pretend that they're a gladiator, or that they can play the trumpet, or that they're a stage performer. And here he gets personal. He says, this is the way you are right now, right? You're the sort of person that doesn't think about what's all involved with an activity, and just sort of tries out different things, whether it's to be an athlete or a gladiator or an orator or a philosopher, right? He says there's nothing that you kind of commit your whole self to, right? You're more like a monkey, he says, mimicking whatever you see. You don't sort of pursue things the way you should, where you consider, well, what all actually is involved here? You know, where you give a thorough review of the whole. You don't put your heart into things, he says also, right? So this is the kind of thing that basically you can think of this remark as partly just as talking about what is it for you to find a true calling or vocation. Now, when it comes to the role of being a philosopher, he says, what commonly happens is people maybe see somebody who's a philosopher, or they hear them speak, somebody like Euphrates, although he says Euphrates was an especially good speaker, maybe unique. And then they decide, hey, I want to be a philosopher too. But they don't really think about what is involved in being a philosopher. So some of the handbook has been giving us exercises and been talking about the value of being a philosopher and what all is involved. And here, you can, in this remark, it's really like Epictetus is going to like press home on that idea and that, you know, really make clear to the reader, this is not an easy undertaking, right? And it's not maybe for everybody, right? So instead of just deciding, oh, I'm going to be a philosopher, he says, hey, what you should do is first think about what actually is involved with that activity. What does it mean to be a philosopher, right? And then second, he says you should study your own nature, right? Because people are suited for different things. He thinks not everybody can be a wrestler. Not everybody can be a gladiator. Maybe somebody is more suited for being a pentathlete. And the implication is not everyone can be a philosopher. Um, so, or another way to put it is philosophy isn't for everyone, right? So um, just like you would examine your body, if you were trying to decide, like say you thought, I want to be an Olympic athlete, but you're trying to figure out, well, what is my sport? So he says you need to examine yourself, your soul, your mind. Like what are, and beware that if you're going to become a philosopher, just like the way that the athlete has to undergo serious training, the philosopher has to do that too. All sorts of things are going to have to change, he says, if you're going to really be a philosopher. Like what sorts of things? He says, and he puts this in the form of a question, but I want to just read it. I mean, I think it's nice the way he puts it. He says, do you suppose you can go in for philosophy and eat and drink just as you do now? Or get angry and irritated in the same way? And the answer should be no, you can't. So you need to prepare. You would need to be willing to eat and drink differently. You would need to be willing to maybe get less angry, less irritated. Um, he says you're going to have to go without sleep sometimes. You're going to have to work really hard. Maybe stay away from friends and family in some cases. This is maybe part of what's hard about being a student at Epictetus' school, right? You're going to be disrespected by other people, including maybe even a young slave, right? You're going to get mocked by people in the street. And we saw that in an earlier remark when he said, hey, if you're beginning to lead the life of a philosopher, people may get defensive and they may make fun of you and they may criticize you, right? So these are all things you have to prepare for. This is part of the training. This is part of the hardship. And some of the result of being a philosopher and undergoing this kind of training and living in this way, he says, is you're going to come off worse in maybe how you rank in things in life. You're going to come off worse at the office. You're going to come off worse maybe in the courtroom. Everywhere, in fact, he says. So those are some of the costs. Are you willing to pay those things? Are you willing to exchange those things? And then you might be thinking, well, what do I get? And he says, are you, think about all this and see whether you were willing to exchange all of this for what you'll get if you become a philosopher, which is, he says, calm, freedom, and tranquility, right? If you're not willing to make those sacrifices, he says, don't go near philosophy, right? Because otherwise you're just going to be playing at being a philosopher the way that children do, right? First they play like they're a philosopher, then a tax collector, then an orator, then maybe an imperial officer. And that's sort of not what Epictetus is urging on us. He says, you need to try to be one person. There's a kind of wholeness that we're after, an integrity of what it is to be you. And whatever it is, you're going to end up good or bad at that thing that you become, right? And then the way he puts it is it's a choice. And this goes back to the fundamental rule of Stoicism, the distinction between what's up to us and what's not up to us. He says, you either are going to work on your commanding faculty, right? This power of choice, this moral capacity that each one of us has, or you're going to work on external things, right? Either you're going to be working on your inner nature or on things out in the world, right? That's where you should focus your efforts either on one or the other, not on both. Remember, you can't sort of be committed to both. You need to be all in on one or all in on the other. And that means, he says, either you're going to adopt the role of a philosopher or you're going to adopt the role of an ordinary or uneducated person. Okay. So which is it going to be? All right, that's it for this week. I will see you next week for week 8 of Practicing Stoicism. Take care.